Okay. And so I just want to finish up from last night. We've been looking at what does it mean to know the sound of the shofar, because I believe it's related to Yeshua's statement to certain people who will point out all the, I hate to say them, flashy things they've done, because each of those is a legitimate ministry, casting out demons, doing miracles in his name and so forth. That's legit. Okay, that is part of ministry. Why you do it sometimes is not legit. If you're doing it for self-glorification, the attaboys and attagirls and that sort of thing. And, the test for me is always, if somebody new comes to a fellowship or a congregation, you might want to ask them up front, are you willing to just sit here and worship with us for 3 years before you take on any responsibilities or obligations whatsoever? And that weeds them out pretty fast, because if they've come in with an agenda to drive their personal agenda, to drive their personal ministry and so forth at the cost of whatever the existing vision of the congregation is together as a unit, then it's best to find that out up front. It doesn't mean they will sit there for 3 years before you call on them, but that's really a fitness test. Because if we're servants of one another, then we're going to trust the Father to bring out our gifts at the proper time. And we don't have to be seen and heard. Remember that old adage we used to tell children, which they don't say that anymore, but children are to be seen and not heard, but you knew really they didn't want to see you either. They wanted you to go outside and play. But that test, like, can you serve without being somebody, right? And if you're willing to do that, look how long Yeshua served without being somebody. About the age of 30, he finally comes onto the scene, but we don't have much information between the age of about 12 and 30. That's a long time, to sit on the pew and not to be recognized if you are the future King of Kings and Lord of Lords in training, and so there's no one of us better than Yeshua, not in my opinion. I haven't met anyone yet, I think, who can top Yeshua. And so if he's willing pretty much to ride the pew and to prepare to serve, we can see that characterized by his ministry. He never lorded anything over anyone. He never said, look at my miracles. He would say, go and don't tell anybody. Isn't that strange? You would do something so fantastic and say, don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody what I just did. He was more interested in concealing his service than having the attention brought to him for an inappropriate reason, even though they still sought him out for inappropriate reasons. They were interested in repenting. They were interested in being healed sometimes. And so this is what I mean. It kind of sorts out your motivation, because if you're not willing to know him through service and suffering, later he might say, you know what, because you weren't willing to know me through suffering and service, you never really knew me, and I don't really know you. And that's what we want. We want to pick up from there. What does it mean to know Yeshua, to know the sound of the shofar? And we're about to enter into maybe a negative aspect of knowing someone. McKetz has a praise report over there in the chat box if you want to glance over there and look while I pull this up. Darlin has been a darling today. Where did that go? Oh, Boozy. Why are you so gripey? There you are. Okay. All right, so this is where we left off last night. Going back to this verse where Paul says, I know whom I have believed, and I'm persuaded that he is able to keep that, to guard that, which I've committed unto him against that day, or until that day. right? And the key statement here is, he says, I know whom I have believed, right? Remember Yeshua telling I believe it was a Samaritan woman, he said, Jews know what they worship. They know, they've experienced suffering for the sake of their worship, so knowing is a deep, multi-purpose word, and Paul is not using it here randomly. If we take that Greek edo and put it back into the Hebrew, it's yada. And if you've done Creation Gospel Workbook 1, you know that da'at, which is the noun form, that's the spirit of knowledge, right? It's the sixth spirit. It's a sacrificial sort of knowing. It's backward from the way we understand it in English. In English, we would say, well, knowing is having the information, but then understanding and wisdom is knowing how to apply it. No, that's wrong. In Hebrew, it's just reverse it, because wisdom is the information. Understanding is learning how to divide that information out. But knowledge is the experience that went with that information. So our point last night was, if we are to know the sound of the shofar, then it is to know Yeshua and suffering for the gospel, because this is what Paul says, I've suffered for the gospel. He says it twice, but he says, because of this suffering, he says, I know whom I have believed. Some people are serving Adonai and they don't really know him, because they have refused all discipline of the word. They want to walk in the glory of the word, the casting out demons and the miracles and so forth, but they don't necessarily want to endure the suffering the word is going to incur in their lives when it begins to disciple them. That's what disciple, discipline, same root word. So from there, I wanted to kick off from there. And I wanted to insert this, again, as we're kind of getting ready. I know we haven't done Purim yet. We're in the process of doing Purim, but we tend to look over Purim sometimes to Pesach, to Passover. And so we're not skipping over Purim. We'll spend the rest of the week doing Purim down at Save the Nations with the Albans, but kind of look forward. Again, it keeps going back to this conversation of, why did Messiah talk about the days being shortened? Why did the prophets talk about a particular day being hurried, right? And it's connected with the sound of the shofar. Resurrection is definitely connected with the sound of the shofar. And so we looked at two things last week, and I reminded last night's class, I feel like I did a much better job of explaining the shortening of the days on the Shabbat live stream. Even though I did it in class, I think I did a better job because I tried to slow down and help people who didn't have the, more fundamental understanding. So if you want to review that, it might help you too. Sometimes I have to hear something several times to really internalize it. But the idea, is that with the feast times, they're so vital, but they're all interconnected. So we don't really want to look at the Feast of Trumpets in isolation from the other feasts as it concerns the resurrection. There might be more to the story. And we went back to Passover and we looked at some twin verses there, where it looks like you're getting ready to leave at Pesach, but then, you get this bigger picture at the Feast of Trumpets of the greater body Messiah rising up. And then, of course, we've gotten into some other literature that really links Pesach, Shavuot, and the Feast of Trumpets, as well as the other fall feasts, in terms of all of it tying together with the resurrection. So I ran across this as I was preparing something for Purim. It's Exodus 12:26. And this is the point where Pharaoh, he's reached his breaking point. It says, Pharaoh arose in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was no home where there was not someone dead. All right, so this represents for us the realm of the dead. Then he called for Moses and Aaron at night and said, rise up, get out from among my people, both you and the sons of Israel, and go. Worship the Lord as you have said. Take both your flocks and your herds as you have said, and go and bless me also. All right. So the flocks and herd, if you've done the workbook 4 study on the scarlet harlot and the crimson thread, I taught a pattern of how the patriarchs, they were always getting out of tribulation with extra flocks and herds. And over time, as you look at that pattern, you realize, yeah, Jacob did build Sukkot for his flocks and herds that he rescued from the land of Lavan. And so they came to symbolize those from among the nations who would attach themselves to Israel in exile. And then when Israel goes back to the land, they go with them, they become part of it. And one of those symbols, of course, is going to be their flocks and their herds. And so this is why I always wonder, like, why did Moses say if the livestock didn't go with the people, they wouldn't go? Well, I think it has to do with, who has attached themselves to Israel and become part of Israel. They're not going to go if they don't go. Everybody has to go together. So the language that Pharaoh is using here, rise up, get out from among my people, both you and the sons of Israel, go worship the Lord. Well, what's going to happen at the resurrection? We're going to come out from among the dead. We got that. We're going to rise up. We got that. And Paul says, so shall we ever be with the Lord, right? We're going to live before him. We're going to worship him. And this is exactly what, Pharaoh is saying. It's just like what Paul was saying, go and worship him, right? So there's a parallel there, but this is Pesach. We're looking for it at the Feast of Trumpets. Why at Pesach? Well, again, it goes back. I don't know if you remember when COVID first set in, I did a live stream. I think it was a live stream called The Most Important Shabbat of Your Life, because these two Shabbats, the Shabbat Hagadol, which precedes Pesach, and then the Shabbat Shuvah, which precedes Yom HaKippurim. It's sandwiched by Rosh Hashanah and Yom HaKippurim. These are two special Shabbats. Nobody really knows when they arose, but they have a special prophetic significance because of their timing relative to the movement of the children of Israel out of Egypt. All right. And so if Shabbat Hagadol is important relative to the Exodus from Egypt, then it's bookend Shabbat Shuvah, which is return, repentance, and so forth. It's probably going to have a special significance related to the greater Exodus or the resurrection of the dead. And so this idea that there might be a preliminary rising at Passover. We got that in Yeshua's resurrection. But it might have been showing us again the connection to the rising of the whole body of Messiah at the Feast of Trumpets. Is there some preliminary event, some preliminary rising Exodus-like event that will occur at Pesach, when Yeshua, in the year of Yeshua's return, to where his own enter into a cloud? Remember, the rabbis call it the cloud of glory or Sukkot of glory. And when you keep Sukkot, remember, he says it's in remembrance of when I brought you out of Egypt. So it's like the Holy One in the Torah is saying, don't try to disconnect Passover from Sukkot. At some point in the future, you're going to see a clear connection here. In the meantime, just trust me. And so that, again, it takes us back to these words, rise up, go worship the Lord. And so the feast, the shofar, it needs to be blown over every feast, which will remind you at every feast that there is some aspect of the resurrection being taught to you through worshiping at that feast. Like Pharaoh said, go worship the Lord as you have said, right? You're hearing something, go do it, because, I'll just keep suffering and losing everything if you stay here with me, get out of here. And of course, they were more than happy to go, and we will be more than happy to go Although we hate to leave, people suffering in the world, there is a point where you do have to know the sound of the shofar. All right, I just wanted to tuck that into last night's lesson before we move on to Gideon and, the shofar army, so to speak. And last night we reviewed again how the teruah is the sound of the battle. When we hear the sound of the shofar, it's a sound of battle. It's the sound of the Holy One moving from the judgment seat to the mercy seat for his own, but yet also understanding at the same time that teruah, for us, it's a shout of joy, but for the world, it should inspire terror, because his position on the mercy seat is exclusively for those gathered in the Mishkan, right? That's the mercy seat was installed in the Mishkan. Those outside the Mishkan, those outside the camp, the suggestion is they are still going to be judged according to the strict justice of the judgment seat. So when you hear the sound of the shofar, it's either joyful because we know finally the tent is being erected, the tent is rising up to the presence of Adonai, or for some, it should inspire awe, terror, regret, repentance, all these things. But Gideon is going to help us understand what knowing is. We're still talking about knowing the sound of the shofar, going back to the horns of these gazelles and how they could turn quickly, how Messiah is being asked to turn quickly, like the cool of the evening. So we have one aspect of knowing, which is positive, it's intimacy, it's growing in unity, it's bearing fruit. There's another aspect of knowing, which says if you're going to do that, if you're going to have intimacy, if you are going to grow into unity, if you are going to bear fruit, then you're going to have to suffer for the sake of that relationship. Adam, before he knew his wife, had to go into a deep sleep, which represents death, and he had to lose a rib. So he had to give up flesh and bone in order to gain something that is going to multiply his positive influence in the earth. So knowing something means that you've suffered, you've sacrificed, and only then can you come into unity with it and bear fruit. That's what Yeshua seems to be saying. You did the flashy stuff, but really, was the fruit a reflection of me, of the word, or was the fruit really bad fruit that was just reflecting your own aspirations and lifting up your own self-esteem? And there's another type of knowing here. This, we want to know him in the fellowship of his suffering because his discipline, it's apportioned out in portions we can live through and come out better on the other end. There's another type of knowing, and this type of knowing is punishment. It's thorns of judgment, and the specific context of this type of knowing, it's the punishment for being apathetic and waiting for the sure thing. When it comes to battle, remember, you hear the sound of the teruah and you're joyful because you have already known that sound. You have already had battles for the sake of the kingdom. And you realize, you know what, I have known him in the fellowship of his suffering, and I will know him at this sound. This is the reward. This is the payoff for being willing to just get down in the trenches with Yeshua when it was muddy and it was cold and it was snowy and it was not fun and people were shooting at me with words. Hopefully not literally shooting at you. But there are other people who are more apathetic in their walk. They want to wait for the sure thing. And I don't know about you guys, but I know I've talked to people who you tell them the truth of the Torah, the truth of the Shabbat, the truth of clean eating, the truth of the feast and so forth. And they're kind of with you. They're not going to say anything against it. Well, they'll say, yeah, maybe I think maybe in the kingdom, maybe we'll eat like that, or maybe in the kingdom we'll keep those feasts. But somehow they think they're living in a God-free zone. They're waiting for the sure thing, just in case we're wrong about that. They don't want to commit. there's some apathy, because see, if I believe what you're saying and I act upon it, then I will have to suffer for the kingdom the way that you're suffering. It's going to cost me something. It's going to cost me my church family. It might cost me some of my family. It might cost me, the wonderful praise and worship services that make me feel good. It might cost me, this wonderful, beautiful Bible camp for my kids, and a peer group for my kids, and that's fully developed and so forth. And you're not really trusting the Holy One. Like Paul said, I know who I've believed, and I'm persuaded that he's able to keep that which I have committed to him against that day, until that day. Paul had to leave behind his structure too. He was a rabbi of rabbis. He grew up at Gamliel's feet. That religious world was at his fingertips, and he never looked back. He never looked back, because he realized to know Yeshua was to take all that stuff that had prepared him for his job and to move it forward. And so we don't want to be angry with the church. It prepared us for our jobs. And once, just like Paul, he had to encounter Yeshua. Well, we have encountered the Torah. Everything we learned in the church, most of it, was to prepare us. Now that we have the Torah and the covenant, it prepared us to move forward with Yeshua and the Torah. But if you're kind of milling around, well, I like the shofar, I like a prayer shawl, I like to do a Passover for fun, but there's no real commitment to it, because anything beyond that would require some suffering, some separation, some long looks, some being politely asked to leave. Maybe it'll cost you something. And so there's an apathy there, kind of waiting around like, yeah, I'll ride with that when Yeshua comes back. I don't believe you. You're just Gideon, right? You're just Gideon. You think you're chasing the enemy, but you might just be chasing your tail. They don't know how to evaluate the move of the Spirit in their generation and act on it. And they don't know it because they're not willing to suffer for it. They're just kind of hanging around. Well, there's a penalty for that. There is a knowing it. Like, if you don't want to know him, he'll know you, but he'll know you a different way than what you're expecting. So let's go back into some prophecies found in Hosea. A lot of you are familiar with that because it's addressed to Ephraim, which is another way of referring to the 10 northern tribes who were exiled, scattered, and completely lost their identity among the nations because of the idolatry of Jeroboam setting up golden calves in Bethel and Dan. And like I said last night, I think this is the reason Ephraim and Dan's names are missing from the list of tribes in Revelation. We know they're there because it precedes it and says all the tribes are there, but then it fails to mention, instead of Ephraim, we get Joseph and Manasseh, right? And Dan's names excluded, because Ephraim and Dan, at least in the Jewish tradition, those names are particularly attached to idolatry. Jeroboam, who set up the golden calves, was an Ephraimite. And the other place he set up the golden calf was in the territory of Dan, who's always had difficulties, apparently. That they were always the last ones apparently moving, and it somehow that carried over into their spiritual significance. But they will be returned, right? All the tribes, it says they're going to be returned. But in this return, the idolatry of Ephraim and Dan, that there can't even be a shred of that, right? So let's look at, and Hosea prophesied a lot to Ephraim. So here's what Hosea says in chapter 10, verse 8. And again, this is addressed to Ephraim, the northern tribes, with a reputation of idolatry, or I think one prophet called him a half-baked cake, or a cake not turned, which would be half-baked. But here's what he says. Also, the high places of Avon, which is going to be sin, the sin of Israel will be destroyed. Thorns and thistles will grow on their altars. Then they will say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. Right? So what's the context here? Well, if we slip down here to Revelation 6:16, it says, they said to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the sight of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. Obviously, they've gotten a glimpse of Adonai on the throne of justice, on the judgment seat. They've gotten a glimpse of the wrath of the Lamb, and they're saying to the rocks and the mountains, fall on us. Right? They didn't know the sound of the shofar as a joyful shout. Now they're feeling it as battle. Luke 23:30, Yeshua even cites this verse. It says, then they will begin to say to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. Who is he talking about? Well, in its original context, it's to the Ephraimites. It's to the exiles who were sent away for idolatry. And these altars that they've set up, not just the golden calf altars, but all these other alternate altars that represent their sin, those places are going to be destroyed. And they're going to recognize finally that those altars can't save them. They're going to realize at that point, there's only one who can save them. And so the thorns and the thistles here, that's a symbol of punishment for sin. Takes you back to the garden, right? The earth is going to yield thorns and thistles for you. So he's going to say it's a replay of the Garden of Eden. If these are the exiles of Israel, and then eventually in Revelation, if it's extending out into the nations of the world who failed, again, to turn around, who failed to recognize him as the only Elohim, as the only one who has the power to establish a Shabbat, as the only one who has the power to establish the feast days, as the only one who has the power to establish your diet and every other thing in the Torah. If you fail to recognize that and still believe you can build your high places, that you can stand like the king of Babylon in the place of God, and you establish your Sabbaths and your feast days and your diet and everything else, at this point, the thorns and the thistles will grow on those silly altars that you constructed in your mind. And you're going to be just as ashamed as Adam and Eve, who were hiding among the trees of the garden, knowing those thorns and thistles are ahead. They're in a beautiful place, but now they start hiding because the punishment for what they've done is coming. Let's see, I think I already went over this. Yeah, okay, we went over why Ephraim and Dan might be omitted from that list by name, but not by presence. So let's go on to Hosea 10:9. Okay, we've just read the fall on us, mountains and rocks fall on us in the prophecy. We saw Yeshua talk about it. We saw John talk about it in the book of Revelation. So we can see this principle. It spans all the way to the end, to the return of Messiah, to where at first, the northern tribes who refused to repent and return, now their altars are going to grow full of thorns and thistles. Try saying that fast. Eventually to the world. But here's what he says in the next verse. He says, since the days of Gibeah, you have sinned, O Israel. There they stood. All right, so there they stood. It makes you think of something. It takes you back again to Mount Sinai. And what did they do at Mount Sinai? They stood. They all stood there at the base of the mountain. And this is where they said, we will do and we will hear. This is where they made a commitment to a covenant when they heard the 10 words. So in the same way that there was a number of them who stood there at Mount Sinai, agreed to the covenant and fully intended to follow through at the time, among them, apparently, like Moses says, beware that there's not one among you with a bitter root, who thinks you can stand there and bless yourself, and all these curses won't come upon you when you violate the covenant. Beware that there's not one of these among you, because there were those among them who stood at Mount Sinai and somehow in their heart of hearts believed they didn't have to obey this. They could make a verbal commitment and not obey it. So there they stood. And then we've looked at other passages where Moses refers to everybody, all Israel who entered into the covenant, whether they were literally at Sinai, they were still at Sinai. They stood there. We stood there, right? Nitzavim is the Torah portion. Nitzavim, you were standing. So in the same way that they were standing for a good thing, for the covenant, at the very same time, there were idolaters among them. And so the first judge of Israel, after they entered the land, they began to enter into idolatry. Okay, this is the time of Gibeah. And they said, when Joshua passes, that bitter root sprang up. And you have stood within this nation, you thorns and thistles, you bitter roots, you have stood among Israel from the time of the first judge of Israel after they entered the land. And this points us back to the time that, remember, the concubine was killed in the territory of Benjamin. She was abused all night, killed. And so I'm not sure what you call the husband of a concubine, but we'll just call him a husband. He, in order to arouse action from among the other tribes, he had to do something drastic. He dismembered her and sent a piece to each of the tribes. This tells us that the rabbis say that they were reluctant to discipline Benjamin for their immoral conduct. And if you read the account of the battle, they didn't beat him the first time, because they were not united in resisting the idolatry. That tells you there were idolaters among them too. They stood at Gibeah. And so this idolatry within Benjamin, which is linked with sexual immorality, it can only be overcome if we stand for it. If there are those among us who were standing for that immorality and therefore that idolatry, even in the secret places of their heart, they're still standing there from the time of Gibeah. And at some point, when the temperature's right, those seeds will spring up among us. So they've always been around. So that would carry us into the story of Gideon. He's also called Yerubbaal. Yerubbaal, because of the it's not a prank, but destroying his father's idols. That's how we earned that name. Because his father basically said, I'm not going to discipline. If Baal's Baal, then he's going to have to discipline him. So if there's no power to Baal, then how can Gideon be disciplined, for destroying the idol? And so the other name, and I thought this was interesting. This is just one of those stick it in your pocket things because it's probably not worth much, but another name that Gideon was known by was Bedan. Bedan. I read that in a particular source. They said he had three names: Gideon, Yerubbaal, and Bedan. And Bedan, they say, refers to the end of Gideon's life when he too fell into idolatry. Remember, he took the crescent ornaments from the Midianites. He took the camel's crescent ornaments and kept them. And just like the bronze serpent, it became a point of sin. It became a point of idolatry. And they say that's when he came to be known as Bedan, because it means servile, like to be a slave to something. He again enslaved Israel to the idols. So they called him Bedan. Well, how does that sound like to you? Do we have a leader today who would lead us into servile existence, who became weak. Interesting. I just, the spelling of it would be very close. At any rate, the story of Gideon, if you want to read through it again, and I suggest you do, especially as we go into Pesach, because the story of Gideon, the battle part of it takes place during the time of Pesach. And it even talks about, I believe he made matzah. But in chapter 6, we can see the Israelites, they had had 40 years of peace with Deborah as a judge. Deborah has passed away, and then they fall into idolatry again. And in the story, it tells us that the Midianites came up and they consumed and destroyed everything the Israelites produced: livestock, crops, standing crops, stored crops. And they did this for 7 years to starve them out. 7 years. I don't know. I'm not going to chase that rabbit, but maybe you want to. But as the story progresses, what we realize, it's not just the Midianites, it's Amalek. We are in the season of Amalek. And if you'll notice about Amalek, they don't stay in one place. You might see Amalek out in the wilderness. You might see Amalek here, even in the north part of Israel. You might see Amalek in Persia. And so the rabbis say it's not a specific people group, it's a mindset, it's a spirit, it's a murderous spirit that attaches itself to people. So it can appear anywhere. And so we realize at this point, Amalek has shown up, which that murderous selective memory of Amalek. And then also it says the people of the east. They joined Midian in the valley of Jezreel, which we know is a prophetic valley. Again, there's a lot of prophecy here. And they're joining the battle against Gideon. So Gideon, he's kind of hemmed in. He can't call everybody. But he calls, and the verb there is yitka, from where you get tekiah. One of the shofar calls, like that long wake-up call, is the tekiah. And so Gideon calls, or he yitka, this awake from your sleep call to the rest of his tribe, Manasseh, or Menashe, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. He calls them to him with the sound of the shofar. And this is one of the functions of the shofar. It assembles people, and then it can also signal battle. And so in this process, you know the story, Gideon gradually discards all but 300 warriors. And if you remember, Samson tied 300 foxes' tails together and set fire to them. He put torches on them and turned them loose. And they destroyed the Philistines' standing crops, their stores of grain, and even their olive groves. So we've got a number that's going to appear in the reign of 2 judges here in terms of exacting judgment and punishment upon their enemies. Gideon getting vengeance on the Midianites for destroying their food for 7 years. And then later in the rule of Samson, he'll do the same thing to the Philistines. But here's what Gideon tells his men. He says in Judges 7:18, when I and all who are with me blow the shofar, then you also blow the shofars around the entire camp and say, for the Lord and for Gideon, or Gideon in Hebrew. And the verb he uses here, remember, savav, we looked at that, the significance of savav last night, because our verse we're working with in Song of Songs is, turn, my beloved, like a gazelle or a young stag, do your circuit quickly. Well, those circuits are announced, the points along that circuit of the feast, they're announced by the blowing of the shofar. And so Gideon has them surround the camp, get in a circle around it. And remember, they've got their earthen jugs with the lights in them in one hand, and then they've got their shofars. They're not going in with swords until, once they break their earthenware jars, then they can pull a sword. But what goes before them? The light of the Torah goes before them to prepare the way. And so you blow that shofar, svivut, around that camp. What is he getting? He's getting a spirit, a Holy Spirit working on the behalf of the 300 to go before them. And that's, those are some shofars from South Africa. They say they've got lots of those types of gazelles or antelope. But one of the spiritual functions of the shofar, and we see this process as Gideon is, with the direction of Adonai, he's weeding out warriors. Because sometimes you have soldiers who aren't necessarily warriors. Sometimes you have warriors who are not heroes, great men, gevelim. The gevelim, or the great men, or the heroes, you would go back to the 5th day of creation and the 5th spirit of Adonai, which is the spirit of gevurah. Gevurah. The gevurah is not necessarily the strongest person, but it's the person who can complete the task. And so that's a hero. A hero is somebody who can complete the task. They may not be, see, Gideon didn't line them up and pick the strongest. He lined them along the water and picked the ones who didn't lap like dogs, right? They were alert because they were in it. They were all in this with Gideon. And so what a shofar will do, and we see this in the preparation for the battle, how the soldiers are gradually being weeded out until there are 3 strong, spiritually committed men. And so that final separation, remember, it occurred at the waters. It separated waters from waters. It's the waters separated the heroes from the soldiers. And so it was in the battle, you only have the heroes. You have 300 heroes, 300 strong men who are all in this. And they blow the shofar. They're not wishy-washy. They're not kind of standing around saying, I wish I was back at home. You know, I'm just here because my family came, or I'm just here because I'm ashamed not to, but my heart's not really in it. Remember the questions that they had to ask the warriors before they went to battle to make sure they were all in? Because if they weren't, they would hold back those who were. And so they have to blow the shofar. What's going to happen? The same thing. There's going to be a separation. It's going to divide those who are all in with the Holy One from those who are all out. Anybody who's not committed to this battle is going to run when the shofar sounds. Now, the Midianites at some points in history were allies of the Israelites. The Kenites, who were descended from Jethro, they were Midianites. He was a Midianite. He was a priest of Midian. Moses' wife was a Midianite. So this is showing us another level of dividing those who are in from those who are out or standing on the fence so that they can ride with the winner. Jethro went all in. And if we go back one rule into the rule of the judge Deborah, as Deborah and Barak, the army has defeated the enemy, then the Canaanites are on the run. Their iron chariots got bogged down. It was a silly place to bring iron chariots. They got bogged down. They weren't any use to them. It would be like driving all your tanks into a tank trap. They're just not going to do you any good down there because their wheels got bogged down. So Sisera runs from the army, and he runs where he thinks he has protection. He runs into the territory of the Kenites, who were also descended from the Midianites. And this is how we know that this battle is in the north. Judges 4:11 talks about it being near Kadesh, which was in the north. Kadesh again means holiness. So the Torah tells us that the Midianites settled in the wilderness of Judah, in the south. But for some reason, Yael and her husband, Hever, they are dwelling in the north. But because they are Midianites, descended from Midianites, Sisera thought he had an ally. So he turns aside and he hides in Yael's tent. But he doesn't understand if there's a reason that Yael and Hever have separated from their kin. It's an additional degree of separation. So not only do you have a certain number of Midianites who have joined themselves to Israel, even among those, there's an additional degree of holiness. Just like with the army, the 300 had an additional degree of competency in the spirit from the other soldiers. And so rather than staying down there with their kin in Judea, they've come north to Kadesh, an extra separation of holiness. And of course, we know Yael nails him. She just drives a tent stake through his head because she's real clear. She's not on the fence here. She's not going to wait and see who wins. She's with Gideon and the Lord, right? And she pounds him. And so again, this is another level of helping us understand how dangerous it can be to ride the fence, because we've got Midianites here. We have those who are rejecting the Torah, and the text says they dwelled among the Amalekites. They had an offense against Israel. But there was a certain number of these Midianites, called Kenites, who dwelled with Israel. They rejected those notions. They rejected the Amalekite mindset. It says the only way I can make things right with the father is to kill my other brother. You know, that Amalek is a descendant of Esau. He's the worst of Esau. And so Amalek's constantly trying to ambush, no matter where they might be. And so Yael is all in. And at this point, she's risking death because their particular little band of Kenites, the text tells us, was in covenant with Yavin, who was the Canaanite king of Cheroshet Goyim. And if that sounds familiar, it should, because we've been talking about the Cheroshim, or the Cherash, the four craftsmen, the craftsmen of the tabernacle, the four craftsmen of the apocalypse and Revelation. And so this Canaanite king, Yavin, was a king of Cheroshet Goyim, a craftsman of the nations, not the craftsmen that build the holy Mishkan. Instead, these are the craftsmen that are trying to oppose the building of Israel, trying to destroy the building of Israel. But Yael remembers her ancestors' earlier covenant at Sinai. When Yitro, you know, the receiving of the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai occurs in the Torah portion, Yitro, not by accident. There's a message there. It says, you know what, even though it's only Israel standing here, look who joined them. If you're among the nations, you want to enter into a covenant, you can stand here too. You can stand right beside Yitro. So Yael remembers this. She doesn't care what her covenant is with Yavin or her husband's covenant is with Yavin. This came later. This came before this king tries to destroy Israel over a 7-year period, right? So she kills him. She kills the commander of the Canaanite army. She's all in. She's not going to wait and see who wins, because she knows she'd lose her life if for some reason Israel didn't prevail. Just like Rahab, if for some reason Israel didn't prevail, she and her family are going to lose their lives. They're all in. They don't stand aloof. They don't wait and try to pick a winner after the war is fought. Gideon's 300, they're all in against the Midianites, Amalek, and the people of the east. So as we're looking at end times prophecy, this is why the message to Laodicea is saying, I wish you were hot or cold, but you're lukewarm and it's not going to go well. Because now you're going to be disciplined. You're going to be known with thorns. So as we get on into, again, Gideon says, encircle the Canaanites, Sevivot, with your shofars. And this is how the beloved is being begged to turn like a gazelle, swiftly. The armies who think they've encircled us will find out they have been encircled with the shofars and with the light of the Torah. And so this somehow plays into our exile. We might think we're surrounded in exile by enemies. We're really not. Keep your shofar close at hand. Keep the voice of Messiah close at hand. Keep his light. If you've got his voice and his word in your hands, then your sword will be secondary, because he's going to pretty much destroy the enemy before you, and you're just doing mop-up work with the sword. And so this happens, of course, and in chapter 8, Gideon's men start chasing the Midianites. They're defeated, by the sound of the Spirit. Remember, for Gideon's warriors, it's a shout of joy in the battle. For the Midianites, it's a sound of terror. And so they're chasing them, trying to catch them. And they're just exhausted. Gideon's army is exhausted. And so they come to the towns of Sukkot and Penuel. And Gideon doesn't even ask for himself. He says, please just give my men bread and water so they can keep pursuing the enemy. We don't want them to come back. And the men of Sukkot and the men of Penuel, their elders, refuse. What did we say? You can't stand aloof and wait to see who wins. And basically, the men of Sukkot say, are the Canaanites in the palm of your hand? You want us to risk giving you something and they might come back? Maybe you're not really winning this. And so Gideon says, all right, I'm going to keep pursuing them. I'm going to finish my job. But when I come back, I'm going to discipline you. I'm going to know you. The elders of Penuel, they thought their strong tower would save them. They didn't need Gideon. Gideon says, I'm going to come back and I'm going to tear down your tower. Anything you thought that you could create as a hedge against the enemy, I'm going to come back and I'm going to tear it down, because you didn't stand with us in the day of battle. You didn't hear the sound of the shofar. He says to the elders of Sukkot, I think it's 77. He says, I'll come back and I'm going to discipline you with thorns. And then he did. Once he finished his task, he came back. So think of Yeshua, on the day of battle, and he's looking around, and it's written in his word, the things we need to know about the day of battle. But you've still got some people who are riding the fence because they think they've got their own towers of protection. They say, well, we don't really know about how this is going to turn out. So let us just kind of stay in our towers. Let's just stand back and watch. And whoever wins, that's who we'll ride with. And at least this way, we won't make the Midianites angry if Gideon loses. It's not the day to ride the fence. So why thorns? Why did Gideon come back and say, I'm going to discipline you or know you with thorns? In Song of Songs, chapter 2, verse 2, all the way back at the beginning of the chapter, we read that the darling is a lily among the thorns. And we read, some of the commentary that says these are the righteous, these are the darlings. They're the tender, beautiful flowers that are growing up, but they're surrounded by worthless plants that are hedging around them. We looked at Isaiah 5, 5 and 6. It explained that Israel is the vineyard that's become overgrown with briars and thorns. Same thing Gideon's experiencing. He's got some good, righteous people willing to go to war with him. He's got 300 heroes who are even of greater spiritual stature than the rest of the warriors. But they're surrounded by briars and thorns, like the elders of Sukkot, like the elders of Penuel. And so Isaiah talks about how the vineyard is overgrown with briars and with thorns. There's going to be those who are right beside you. They might use the same language. They might say Yeshua and Torah. They might know the feast. They might know the Shabbat. But what they don't know is how to commit to the battle. And therefore, they don't know the sound of the shofar. They might have heard it, but they don't know it. They refuse to be those watch persons on the wall of the vineyard. They are the briars and the thorns. And the same way Adam and Eve, they were sown into a world of thorns. They were exiled from the garden. As we get out into exile, what do we find? We're surrounded by thorns and briars. And when Messiah comes and starts sorting through it, he's going to say, are you with me? That's when he'll know you're the darling. That's when he'll know you're the lily among the thorns. So he will call you out so he can burn up those thorns. In Matthew 7:16, Yeshua says, the grapes cannot be gathered from thorn bushes, nor figs from thistles. He's going to separate them out. And we know both the vineyard and the fig tree, they're metaphors of Israel. So as we think of Yeshua standing there with a crown of thorns on his head, he's standing there like he's the lily of the valley, surrounded by thorns, not just the thorns of Rome. He's surrounded by the thorns in his own vineyard. And he's going to have to separate these out at the end of days. So I wanted you to see the Hebrew of Judges 8:16, where it says, then Gideon took the elders of the city and thorns of the wilderness and briars, and he disciplined the men of Sukkot with them. Right? Now, if you look there at the spelling of that, right? Just take a gander at the spelling. It's Vaidah, comes from yada, to know the sound of the shofar. Happy is he who knows the sound of the shofar. But another word for discipline is yada. And this is what I mean. We have to know what discipline is. If we allow the Father's rod and staff to discipline us, it's a comfort because we know he is preparing us through the daily battles to know the sound of the shofar. Because we've done battle for the kingdom before, we will know it when we hear it. We won't be riding the fence. Like Yeshua said, don't go back inside the house to get your garment, just go. When you hear it, just go. Because if there's anything you're attached to in this world, then you might miss that gathering. You might have to wait for another judgment that is going to come from the judgment seat as opposed to the mercy seat. So to discipline somebody is to know him. And I think that explains this passage. Hebrews 5:5-10. It says, so too, Christ did not glorify himself in becoming a high priest, but it was he who said to him, you are my son. Today I have fathered you. Just as he also says in another passage, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek, which explains the white horse craftsman, right? In the days of his humanity, he offered up both prayers and pleas with loud crying and tears to the one able to save him from death. And he was heard because of his devout behavior. Although he was a son, he learned obedience from the things which he suffered. And having been perfected, he became the source of eternal salvation for all those who obey him, being designated by God as high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. Right? He learned obedience from the things which he suffered. Okay, Yeshua didn't need to learn what obedience was. He was the living word. He was the living Torah. He already knew how to obey. But coming in human flesh, he had to suffer for what he learned, right? He had to suffer for the sake of the word. If you just know what's in the Torah, you haven't known the Torah, because you have to experience what you're learning along with the discipline of learning. You learn suffering in obedience. And that brings a perfection that simply knowing what the text says is not going to bring. It's going to separate the heroes from the warriors. It's going to separate the women judges like Deborah from the ordinary women. It's going to separate the holy Kenites like Yael from the opportunists. Yada is to experience with sacrifice in order to become one with this thing or this person being known. And so Gideon comes back and he says, okay, you wanted them in my hand. Now I've got them in the palm of my hand. I've disciplined the outside thorns. Now I'm going to discipline you. I'm going to know you. Because, see, you didn't want to know the Holy One, and you didn't want to know Gideon in the fellowship of their suffering against the Midianites. Now I'm going to come back and I'm going to know you in a way you don't want to be known. I'm going to discipline you with thorns. I'm going to separate you from those Israelites who were all in. And this is the message of Yeshua. When he returns, he needs to know you because you have experienced your learning through the discipline of learning, suffering through the obedience like he did. If you were standing aloof concerning your obedience and concerning holiness, then he'll know you anyway, but not in the way you want to be known, right? Not in the good way, where you would know the sound of the shofar, but in a different way. He's trying to establish here a pattern of separation unto holiness and victory, both from within Israel, right? He's giving us the example in Deborah's rule of the Kenites, the descendants of Jethro. He's separating the heroes from the warriors with Gideon. And now we can also see it in action against the murderous nations who have aligned themselves with Amalek, who have aligned themselves with the kings of the east. And we see that in Revelation. Now he's going to dry up the Euphrates so the kings of the east can come over. Just a trap. Just a trap. Let's see. I guess we'll just stop there because of time. I'm not really done, but I wanted to keep working with Jethro. But if we don't stop here, I've got some stuff to do later this afternoon. I might be here till this evening. So, but you can see where I'm going with this, can't you? We're going to go back to Sinai with Yitro. And let me read you this one scripture. I can't help myself. I just have to. I'll go all the way to the end so you can fill in the blanks. It says at Sinai, Exodus 15:14, it says, the other nations heard, they were agitated, but only among those other nations, it was Yitro's heart that was shattered into repentance when he heard about the Exodus from Egypt and all the great things that the Holy One had done against Pharaoh. So Exodus 18:12 says, then Yitro, Moses' father-in-law, he took a burnt offering and sacrifices for God, and Aharon came with all the elders of Israel to eat a meal with Moses' father-in-law before God. So what does Yitro do? All the nations are troubled. They're agitated when they hear about the Exodus. But there is one national leader, a priest of Midian, Yitro. He comes. He brings Moses' wife because he's heard, right? He heard everything that had been done for them. And he says, this is the people for me. So they have the sacrificial meal there at Sinai. And then later, what the Midianites, the unholy Midianites, what do? They're trying to destroy the food of the Israelites. That's their point. They're eating the food while it's still standing. They're getting the stores, everything. They're trying to take all the food. But see, Yitro brought holy food, and he shared that covenant meal. And so some people say, well, where did Yitro go after that? Didn't he go his own way? No, they say that when he departed, that what he did is he tried to go back and evangelize his own people, to go evangelize the rest of the Midianites. But he later rejoined Israel, because Judges 1:16 tells us, now the descendants of the Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, went up from the city of palms with the sons of Judah to the wilderness of Judah, which is in the south of Arad. And they went and lived with the people. So the Kenites lived among them. And so that's kind of the moral of the story here. Blessed and happy are the descendants of Yitro, those among the nations who will hear and actually pick up and go and engage in that sacrificial meal. They'll know the teruah, they'll know the resurrection of the dead, because they have known Yeshua through suffering. They've obeyed the word through suffering. And they're going to know that shout. They're going to be separated from their own kind among the nations who refused to make that journey and to suffer for that decision. And in fact, today, there's a people called the Druze in Israel, Druze, and they believe that they are descended from Jethro. So they seem to be a more Arab type of people. I've actually spent a day in a Druze city before. So they'll have a little bit of the elements of Islam, but they'll also have some elements of biblical, maybe we'd call it biblical Judaism, may not be the right term, but they're kind of a hybrid. But they're among the best soldiers of the IDF. They're aligned. A lot of them are conscripted into service there at the wall and to patrol particularly sensitive places in Jerusalem. Number one, because they can speak Arabic. They have Arabic background, but they're not Jews. They can kind of bridge the two worlds, and so they're not as intensely hated by the Muslims, because they share an ethnic background with the Druze. But the Druze historically have been very faithful to serve in the Israeli army. So anyway, I skipped some stuff. We can go back and pick it up next week, but I wanted you to just see the conclusion of how the Midianites are playing into this, and being able to hear the sound of the shofar, and to let the shofar distinguish not just the big picture of the thorns and the briars among the nation, but even among the nation of Israel itself. There are thorns and briars in the vineyard. That has to be separated out, and on the day of battle is when it occurs. And these are the people that they may not be actively working against the righteous among Israel, but what they're doing is this. It's like going and betting on the horse after the race. You don't get to do that. He said, either you're with Adonai and Gideon or you're not. There's nothing in between in a day like this. So it's a long story to read, but if you'll take some time this week and read through the story of Deborah and Gideon again, I bet you'll pick out some more prophetic stuff that's popping up in the book of Revelation.